So, let me see, I think I can make this work. Suffrage, we'll start with the old East Coast ladies because they are still remarkable women, still women who got the ball rolling against all odds. 1848, a group of women who'd been involved in the anti-slavery movement. One day, the little light bulb went on in their heads and they said, wait a minute, when we go to an anti-slavery meeting, we can't speak. And at one major world congress, they actually had to sit behind a curtain. They couldn't be seen either. And one of these women who was sitting around a kitchen table, it's very much a story that resonates with women's movements throughout time. They're sitting around a kitchen table. One of these women is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Her friend, Lucretia Mott, said we need to hold a convention to talk about women's rights. And they did. In 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, a group of women got together, sort of a word-of-mouth thing. They sat down in this church and they talked about what women needed to do. What were women's rights and how would they accomplish them? And they talked about the right to education. In those days, women's education was about making a very good stitch or a very good dinner. But it wasn't about Greek or history or mathematics. They talked about the right to enter the professions. They talked about marital rights, including custody of your children, maintaining some control over your own finances. Women could not sign contracts. And they also talked about suffrage, women voting. And they all signed this petition that listed this list of grievances they had. And they went home, and some of them said to their husbands, I went to a meeting today, and I signed this petition asking for all of these different rights, including the right of suffrage. And several of their husbands told them to go back and take their names off that petition, and some of them did. Suffrage was the step too far. Financial equality was okay, educational equality was okay, but suffrage was a step too far. So some of them, in order to keep peace in their homes, took their names off the petition. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was married, had a bunch of children, I think 5 children, did not take her name off the petition. I can't say it helped her marriage any, but she stayed with the program, she stayed committed to suffrage, and becomes the intellectual driver. She's the one who comes up with the ideas and does a lot of the writing about the suffrage movement. In 1850, her longtime partner joins the movement, Susan B. Anthony. She is the hard worker. She's the one who goes out. She goes into towns, she goes into community halls and starts speaking about suffrage. People throw things at her, they drive her out of town, and she goes right back to work the next day. She is indefatigable. I think that's the first time I've ever used that word. She never tires. And she gets back to New York once in a while to talk to Elizabeth about the next piece of their strategy, the next place they're going, and what's happening out on the road. The other 2 women in this picture are also nationally known suffragists, but they also have North Dakota connections. On top we have Matilda Joslyn Gage. She also lived in New York, was a very hard worker for suffrage, traveled the country, spoke to legislatures, spoke in town halls. She had 2 children who homesteaded in North Dakota. And one of these was her daughter Julia, who married a man named Carpenter. So Julia Gage Carpenter and her husband homesteaded near Lemoore. Had a pretty rough homestead experience there. And in a few years moved on to Fargo. When Julia Gage Carpenter was on the homestead farm, she kept a diary. It's a very nice document of homestead life, useful for many different purposes in research on women on the plains. And every once in a while she'll say, Mother's here for a visit. Well, this is a great privilege for a homesteading woman to have her mother come to visit. Most of them, when they left home, the homestead never saw Mother again. The mother would come by because she was on the road. And so she would stop in Lemoore on her way to the capital to speak, or on her way to another town to speak. But Julia never says Mother's here on her way to speak to the Montana legislature. Mama's here is about all you see. Not a word about suffrage in there. But the interesting thing about Matilda Jocelyn Gage and her daughter Julia Gage Carpenter is that Julia's granddaughter is Jocelyn Burdick, who becomes our first woman senator by appointment after the death of her husband. So that suffragist, feminist, political activist thread follows down through the generations. Belva Lockwood was a very interesting woman, also a campaigner for women's suffrage. She was a journalist. She started the Women's Press Association. And through that organization, she met a woman here in Bismarck, Linda Slaughter, who joined the Press Association, became a great admirer of Belva Lockwood. Lockwood ran for president twice in the 1880s. She organized her own party, as it was called, the Equal Rights Party. She campaigned for president. She got more votes than you might think, I think over 1,000 votes, and embarrassed the heck out of her family. Linda Slaughter corresponded with her. I know that because we have a letter from Belva Lockwood here in our archives in the Slaughter papers. But when Belva Lockwood died, her nephew was in charge of her estate, and he was so embarrassed by her political activity that he burned all of her political papers. So whatever Linda Slaughter wrote to her that made Belva Lockwood say, gosh, you should have been the vice president on my ticket, we will never know, because it went up in smoke. Now, that's the national picture. The West is more welcoming to women's suffrage than most of the East. West is wide open country, and that from 1848 to 1869, there's not much happening. There aren't too many advances in women's suffrage. But in 1869, a Western territory, Territory of Wyoming, passes a bill, the legislature passes a bill giving women full suffrage. It's much the work of Esther Hobart Morris. She invites the legislators to tea. She convinces them of the importance of this bill. It passes in this Wild West territory you would not think was a bastion of progressivism, but it's the first territory or state to give women full suffrage rights in 1869. Esther Hobart Morris became an elected official shortly after the law was passed in her little town in western Wyoming. But I think what's the most remarkable part of the story is that Wyoming embraces women's equality. And it adopts the motto, the equality state, which it still has. It erects this wonderful statue to Esther Hobart Morris, which stands in front of the Capitol building. And it never backs down from the decision it makes. Historians aren't quite sure exactly why the legislature decided to accept women's suffrage way ahead of everybody else. They weren't on a trend, they were in the lead. Some historians have suggested that as a large, sparsely populated territory, women's suffrage might bring more people to the territory. More people meant that they would be able to become a state sooner. You have to have, I think it was about 5,000 people in the territory before they could apply for statehood. Encouraging women to make that migration to Wyoming might have been a help. We're not sure. There's really no smoking gun about this. But we do know that for a long time, Wyoming was the only political entity that offered suffrage to women. In Dakota Territory, which of course you know is both North and South Dakota, and was formed 1861 as our territorial date. In the same year, 1869, one of my very favorite frontier characters, Enos Stutzman, introduces a bill into the territorial legislature offering women full suffrage by simply striking the word male from the election law. That's all he wanted to do. Stutzman was just a great guy. He had an earthy sense of humor. He had a hot temper. He would challenge somebody to a duel in the drop of a hat. And I think he was well liked, and he was smart. He was a good politician. He represented Pembina in the legislature, which met in Yankton. But he was dead serious about this bill to offer women suffrage. He said, if we strike the word male from the election laws, it would confer upon women the elective franchise and eligibility for office. He said the bill was far in advance of old fogey notions. The bill passed the House. It was sent to the Council, which was the territorial equivalent of the Senate. In the Council, the opposition put so many amendments on the bill that became a ridiculous mockery of women's suffrage, and the House rejected those modifications, and so it does not become law in 69. So what we have is an interesting contrast. Wyoming, a large, sparsely populated western territory, offers women the right to vote in 1869. In the same year, another, even larger, even more sparsely populated territory rejects the idea of women's suffrage. We're not seeing a trend yet. Suffrage bills will be introduced into the territorial legislature again and again. Most of them will not get much attention and will not pass. Now, the laws are weak in the Dakota Territory, not just the election laws. It was pretty wide open space in those days. And in 1873, we find out that the election laws do not prevent women from holding office. Linda Slaughter was appointed Burleigh County Superintendent of Schools in 1873. Burleigh County was just organizing. All of the positions that will be elected are appointed at first, and she is appointed Superintendent of Schools. She's extremely well qualified for this position. She has been educated at Oberlin College, which was the only place in the 1840s, not 1840s, 1850s and 60s, when she was in school there, that would educate women on the same footing as men, and African Americans as well. She had experience administering freedmen's schools in Kentucky and Tennessee after the Civil War. She was deeply devoted to the concept of education as a way of improving the status of the citizens of this little bitty, very wild town of Bismarck. After she was appointed, she stood for election for county superintendent 3 different times. Ran against several men each time. One time she was appointed by both the Republicans and the Democrats. She was a Democrat herself, a lifelong Democrat. She did a good job. She organized the school board. She divided the school district into 2 different districts. She built the first brick schoolhouse in Bismarck. She really put education on a firm footing in Bismarck. But of course, there was somebody who said, wait a minute, she can't hold office. She is not a qualified elector. And that's something most of us would say, that the first qualification for office is to be a qualified elector. And she wasn't. So the case went to the Territorial Supreme Court, where they decided that there were no laws that barred women from holding elective office. So she held the office 4 times, once as an appointment, once 3 times elected in her own name. She would not campaign for office because she felt it was unladylike. She would visit women in town and ask them to ask their husbands to vote for her. And she was very successful in that way. She was not a feminist. She was not a suffragist. She was still committed at this time to a model of womanhood that's called true womanhood. And true women were supposed to dedicate themselves to their homes and their families. Slaughter said that she was a true woman. This was a term she used to describe herself. She believed in it. She just couldn't quite act like one. She kept leaving home to teach and to make money, and eventually kicked her drunken husband out of the house and divorced him, which is a very untrue woman-like thing to do. Now, she leaves the superintendency at the end of her term, which ends in 1883. In 1883, the legislature passed a bill providing women with the privilege of school suffrage. This is one of the different kinds of limited suffrage that women are getting around the country. School suffrage is fairly popular because it involves children, and who knows more about children than women? It's a perfectly logical thing. School suffrage means that women can vote for a county superintendent, for any financial issues that come up about the school in their district, and can sit on the school board. Women voted on a separate ballot, and in some precincts they had to put their ballot into a separate box. If we look at those voter registration forms, it's just a list they signed when they walked into the polling place, we see that women were not flocking to the polls. Very few women would show up to vote. On the other hand, women who did vote felt pretty good about it. This is a little note that a woman sent to Linda Slaughter about some sort of visit they were going to have. But in her postscript, she writes, "I cast my first vote today for our county superintendent." There's so much pride embedded in that short statement. I cast my first vote today. How exciting to go to the polls and cast a vote. But she would have probably not had a lot of women to talk to each night. In 1885, the next legislature after the one that passed the school suffrage bill, another suffrage bill was introduced, this one offering full suffrage to women. The man who introduced the bill was Major J.A. Pickler of Faulkton, Dakota Territory, which is now in South Dakota. He was an ardent suffragist. He had very good credentials as a suffragist, as did his wife. But the bill he submitted to the legislature was met with comic derision. I mean, they really made a lot of fun of it in the legislature. Some suggested that the bill on women's suffrage should be referred to the Committee on Indian Affairs. Others said that the bill should be sent to the military committee because the reference there is to women suffragists as militant and sort of difficult to get along with. Or they might send the bill to the Mines and Mining Committee where it could be buried. Outside of the legislature, however, the bill raised a good bit of serious public discussion. Letters were written to the newspapers concerning this bill. The newspapers wrote editorials concerning this bill, and there was really quite widespread support for full women's suffrage. Linda Slaughter wrote a letter to the editor about this bill. It's 1885 now. She started serving as county superintendent of schools in 73. And at that time, she called suffrage a disgrace and a stigma. By 85, she's been divorced. She has supported her family. She has acquired property. She's paying taxes, or actually she's not paying taxes, but she's kind of disturbed by the whole thing about taxes. And she's beginning to understand how important it is for women to have a vote. She wrote to the Bismarck Tribune, "It is perfectly safe to assume that we're all men endowed with the angelic attribute of perfection, and all women possessed of ideal homes. The vexed question of women's suffrage would never have arisen to disturb the vexed dreams of legislators." There she is with her family. She had 3 daughters to support. She and her husband loved each other very much. It's a wonderful love story, actually, but he was draining the family's resources with drink. And she needed to find better ways to live. And she felt that pinch as a person who had responsibilities but no rights. The newspapers around the territory gave the bill a lot of support. The Badlands Cowboy noted that women's rights leaders are cranky, but that women are as well qualified to vote as men. The Jamestown Alert wrote that those who oppose this movement are throwing themselves in front of the wheels of progress. The Bismarck Tribune and the Fargo Argus, neither of them particularly advanced newspapers, also supported the bill. The Big Stone Herald had the most interesting comment. The Big Stone Herald wrote, "The council is afraid to take hold of suffrage in a manly way and desire to have the House take it back before they are forced to put themselves on record. What these gentlemen are afraid of is more than we can understand, unless they fear to give their wives, mothers, and daughters equal rights with themselves and Negroes. It is no argument to say that woman does or does not want the ballot. She has the right, but the question is, has she the privilege?" This is such a wonderful statement because it refers to the idea, that the Enlightenment idea, that all human beings are born with certain inherent rights. And among those rights are to participate in government, to vote. The Big Stone Herald is saying she has the right. She's born with this right. We are all born with the right to vote. The privilege is granted by the legislature. And they are referring there to that fundamental American concept of the right to vote. This bill in 1885 passed the House 29-19 and went to the Council, where it was amended badly, but again passed 14-10. Now the problem in 1885 is that Governor Pierce has already announced that he will not sign this bill unless it carries an amendment that says that the bill must go to the people for final approval. The Governor Pierce is a territorial governor. Territorial governors are appointed by the President of the United States. He doesn't have to worry about the election. So he makes a statement. I don't know that we can say that he was colluding with members of the legislature to get the bill defeated, but that amendment was not attached to the bill as it was passed in the legislature. So when it went to Governor Pierce's desk, he vetoed it, even though it had passed both houses. In 1889, North Dakota became a state. It became a state in 1889, and in the summer of 1889, a constitutional convention was called to write the state constitution. And it was kind of an interesting parade of people coming to Bismarck to speak to the convention about their pet idea. Henry Blackwell, husband of Lucy Stone, both of them campaigned fiercely all over the country for suffrage, spoke at great length to the Constitutional Convention. I think, if I measured the pages of his speech that are recorded in the convention proceedings, his was the longest, which is probably not a good idea. But he did generate some debate among the convention participants about the question of women's suffrage, which is a very interesting study of attitudes in that time. It does not become suffrage does not become part of the state constitution. However, it is important to understand the full suffrage story, that you understand that prohibition does become part of our state constitution. There was another very lively debate in the Constitutional Convention about prohibition. The convention decides that they will write a clause prohibiting the consumption, the manufacture, and the sale of alcohol in North Dakota. But they are so concerned about the effect this clause will have in the state that they submit this clause separate from the rest of the Constitution to the people. The people are going to vote on the Constitution. The convention wants this Constitution to pass, and they don't want passage to sort of depend on this clause or prohibition. So they go to the people separately. The Constitution passes. The prohibition clause passes but by a much smaller margin. It's a very fragile part of the Constitution. And we have to keep that fragility in mind, because it has a lot to do with whether or not women will gain suffrage in North Dakota. Suffrage and prohibition are inextricably linked during the 19th century. It's one of the reasons that suffrage is so slow. It takes 72 years from the 1848 convention in Seneca Falls to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. It takes a long time because so many people say, you give women the right to vote, you'll never have another drink as long as you live. And that's a fearsome thought, especially if you haven't figured out how to bring it in from Canada. But this connection between the two is going to slow the process of suffrage down. And it's going to be an important link here in North Dakota. Now, I'd like to introduce a couple of characters that are going to thicken the plot a little bit. This is Alexander McKenzie, known as Big Alec. He was a big guy, he was a tough guy. He came here to Bismarck in 1872, became Burleigh County Sheriff, and then sort of moved into politics. He came here as a Democrat, but pretty soon he was a Republican because he, no offense, but there isn't much future for Democrats in North Dakota.
Still.
I wasn't going to bring up the still part. You can see the handwriting on the wall. He was an opportunist, so he became a Republican. And he became a very, very effective and smart politician, if not a very, very corrupt politician. He was responsible for moving the territorial capital from Yankton to Bismarck. The word would be engineered, that removal, and put the capital down on a piece of land he happened to own. He's smart, he's powerful. He never holds elective office after he's done with the sheriff's office. But he is the political boss. In the 19th century sense of that term, he runs the politics of the state, and he does it on behalf of the Northern Pacific Railroad, for which the Great Northern Railroad is very grateful. He might be called a lobbyist today, but in his day he was called the boss. He was a boss. He bought votes. He bought legislators. He chose almost every governor between statehood and 1916, with the exception of Eli Shortridge, who's on the wall behind the screen. And we'll speak about Eli Shortridge in a minute. He was ruthless, and he has a lot to do with the suffrage movement in North Dakota. Sort of on the side. He doesn't care about suffrage, and he doesn't care about prohibition either. He wasn't a drinker. He was married, but he kept his wife in New York. He considers himself a North Dakotan, and he said Bismarck was his home, but he lived in St. Paul. He's a very interesting guy, but a formidable political opponent. The other character I want to introduce now is Elizabeth Pressman Anderson. She lived in Tower City. She was elected president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1893, the North Dakota chapter, I'm sorry, and remained president for the next 40 years. Another formidable political presence, deeply committed to prohibition, never wavered on it whatsoever. Now, the WCTU was the largest women's organization in the United States throughout the 19th century. And it was a powerful organization, and it supported suffrage. Their main goal was prohibition, and they kept very focused on that. But they also knew that prohibition would be supported if women had the right to vote. So she keeps an eye on suffrage as well. So now these two characters meet, I don't think literally, but their interests meet in 1893. North Dakota is now a state. In the 1893 legislature, a full suffrage bill is pending. And Elizabeth Pressman Anderson has told a wonderful story about the last night in which the legislature is in session. Midnight is approaching. They have to get done. She describes the legislature as being sort of a gala event that night. Some of them are already celebrating, some of them are drunk. The Senate passes the woman's suffrage bill and sends it to the House. The House, before they take the vote on the bill, in a very gentlemanly way, adjourn the meeting, invite Mrs. Anderson to speak. She does. She speaks for the bill. She sits down, they reconvene, they vote, and they pass the suffrage bill. Governor Shortridge, not McKenzie's man, is down the hall. He has said he will sign this bill. He's waiting for the bill to be brought down the hall to him. But remember, it's nearing midnight. There's a pile of bills that have to be attended to. And McKenzie's men are patrolling the hall to be sure that bill does not get to Governor Shortridge's desk. And it doesn't. It's lost. There's absolutely no use for this gesture except for this particular word. It is lost. And the House goes back to the Senate and says, we lost the bill. Oops. You'll have to recall it and vote on it again. The Senate said, no, we're not going to do that. And the House said, well, you really have to because we lost the bill. And finally, the Senate has to recall the bill because they can't get to all the other stuff they have to do until this is settled. So they recall the bill. The vote fails. Now, why the vote failed the second time, I'm not sure. I don't know if somebody was out of the room and then came back or somebody sobered up. We're not sure. But the bill does not pass the second time. And then the House expunged the record. This means that the record that they had voted for this bill and passed it does not exist. It's because of Elizabeth Preston Anderson telling us this story that we know about. Now, there's another part to this. When the bill passed the House, before it was lost, the Speaker of the House, who's McKenzie's man, won't sign it. He refuses to sign it. And he thinks that's going to kill it. Shortridge is saying, no, if it passes both houses and I sign it, it's law. We don't need your signature. We don't know how that would have ever worked out. It would have been interesting to see that go to the Supreme Court for a decision. It never happens because the bill is recalled. It doesn't pass. It gets expunged. The governor never gets to sign it. Now, why is McKenzie interested in suffrage? The railroads oppose suffrage. That's his first step. Railroads oppose suffrage. He's not going to support suffrage. Railroads oppose prohibition. Why would the railroads care? The railroads are running pretty roughshod over North Dakota. Farmers are paying an awful lot for freight, more per mile for freight rates in North Dakota than other states in this region are paying. The legislature has never been successful in reining in the control of the railroads over North Dakota grain trade, which is the North Dakota economy in the 1890s. So the point that McKenzie's point in doing this is that he has to have prohibition as his little toy. If he loses prohibition, if the state goes wet, he can't use that to force votes on the railroad. I'll try to explain how this works. If a bill comes before the legislature to say rein in railroad freight rates, one of McKenzie's men introduces a bill to put prohibition back before the voters. The prohibition people do not want to see the prohibition bill or clause go back to the voters because they do not think it will pass again. This is the fragile piece of the Constitution that they're worried about. So you take the reformers and you put them in a basket with certain reform ideas. One of them is prohibition, one of them is suffrage, and one of them is control of the railroads. These are progressive ideas that are popping up all around the country. As long as prohibition is law, McKenzie can say to the reformers, if you mess around with my railroad freight rates, I will put prohibition back on the ballot. The prohibition people say, no, don't do that. I will not support this bill to control the railroad freight rates if you will leave my prohibition alone. It's a trade-off. It's one of those things about politics makes strange bedfellows. So we find the reformers saying, leave the railroads alone. And in exchange, you leave my prohibition alone. Suffrage gets caught up in that because we know that if women start to vote, prohibition will have more strength. It will no longer be this little fragile piece that holds McKenzie's empire together. Does that make some sense to you? It's fairly complicated politics. McKenzie was very good at it, when most of the reformers were playing fairly straightforward politics. So, 1893, we have this possibility of a full suffrage bill. It passes both houses, it disappears, and that game is over. In 1895, another bill is introduced into the legislature. This one also passes, also fails. But the important point in 1895 is it's the first time we have a women's movement behind the bill. It's a fledgling movement, it's very small, but it's led by Dr. Cora Smith Eaton of Grand Forks. She later moves to Washington State. She later becomes a national figure in the suffrage movement. She can't quite pull together a good group of women in North Dakota to help her back this bill. So the major argument against women's suffrage in North Dakota at this time is that nobody wants it, except a few newspaper editors. Women aren't asking for it. There is no viable women's organization backing women's suffrage. And one of the arguments is that North Dakota is too rural a state. Suffrage is a middle-class, urban, professional kind of an issue. Rural women, the urban women will say rural women can't be organized. Rural women do organize. These women can get blood out of a turnip, and that literally do. But they focus their energies on their churches and their homes, not the political issues. They aren't interested in suffrage. And it won't be for many years that they begin to see the advantage they could have in having the right to vote. We don't see in North Dakota the kinds of behavior that we see in other states. Women aren't chaining themselves to the state house doors, and they aren't going on hunger strikes. There is no clamoring voice demanding the right to vote. Linda Slaughter corresponded with a woman in South Dakota. Both of them were members of the National Woman Suffrage Association. And at one point, her friend writes to her and says, wouldn't they all laugh if they knew it was just the two of us? We are the National Woman Suffrage Association of North Dakota. It's a very small movement. So from 95 to 1912, bills are introduced. There's no support for them. Nothing much happens. It's a very quiet period in the suffrage movement. But in 1912, finally, we see a very organized movement arise in North Dakota. The Votes for Women League chapters organized in Grand Forks, in Bismarck, in Fargo. Most of the women are associated with universities. Their husbands are university professors. So you see names like Mrs. Ladd and Mrs. Bali, university professors. There's a letter in the archives at UND addressed to a law professor from the dean of the law school, saying that if you don't get your wife out of that suffrage movement, you will find yourself out of a job. So perhaps not all of the women who might have belonged to these organizations were active in them. But they are well organized, they are focused. They have support from the Nurses Association, the Teachers Association, the Uplift League, I think the General Federation of Women's Clubs. And by counting up the memberships of all of these organizations that support suffrage officially, they claim to have 40,000 women following them. That's a huge number in North Dakota in 1912. 40,000 women clamoring, finally, for the right to vote. And it's just in time. In the 1913 legislature, there's Governor Shortridge. In the 1913 legislature, this bill is introduced, passes.
One was not.
both houses. Well, this is 1913. It passes both houses. It's signed by the governor. Everything is legal. This bill shows up in the laws of North Dakota in 1913. But there's a clause on it that says it has to go to the people for a vote in November 1914. People mean men. Only men can vote. You have to always keep that in mind. I don't mean that in any derogatory way, but it's the truth. Only men can vote on it. It's a full suffrage bill. No questions about who's going to be benefiting from this bill or limitations or anything else. The Votes for Women League organized. I love this picture because it's one of two in all of North Dakota about women's suffrage. If you find any more, I'd be interested in seeing them. They went to fairs, they went to town meetings, they went to churches, they went to club meetings. They stood on street corners and handed out literature. Nice middle-class women wearing their white linen dresses, standing on street corners handing pieces of paper to men they don't know. Very interesting situation socially. They worked hard. And in November 1914, the voters turned down the suffrage bill. But in their effort, they left us a lot of paper. And it's nice for a historian to have a paper that explains what their arguments were in 1913 about suffrage. They said women voters would bring moral concerns, such as child labor laws and better housing conditions, into the public political arena. Okay, we're still struggling with some of these issues. They said the phrase "all men are created equal," one of our cherished heritages, means all human beings are created equal. Some of their arguments were a little ridiculous, but nevertheless might have appealed to somebody. When they said a woman who could not discuss politics with her husband risked having him go to someone else. That someone else was a woman with political ideas. You never know what could happen next. Women who could not vote would remain slaves to their husbands. And they said, very specifically, they addressed rural women in their literature. They said rural women should vote. It's about your home. It's about your family. It's about your farm. And if you don't vote, city women will be voting for you. They'll become the voice that you are not using. Now, in 1913, another group also organized the Anti-Suffrage League. The president of the Anti-Suffrage League was married to a railroad executive, not too surprisingly. They also published a lot of literature that they made sure was distributed widely in the state. And their arguments were interesting as well. They said women voters would strengthen the prohibition laws, and they were right. But they also said if you are opposed to prohibition, you really want to be opposed to women's suffrage too. They said political spaces, such as polling places, were masculine and corrupt, and there was no place for women. They said that voting would defeminize women. There were a lot of cartoons of this sort where women are not only defeminized and masculinized, but men are emasculated by the whole concept of suffrage. The caption, if you can't see it, says, "My wife's joined the suffrage movement, and I've suffered ever since." Here he is on his knees cleaning the hearth, and she's telling him, "You're cleaning up." This shifting of gender roles was a major concern, both for the people who sort of were on the border of liking suffrage and those who opposed it. The anti-suffragists said women who voted would not be at home taking care of their husbands and children. So there are a lot of these cartoons will show women getting dressed with a tie, going out the door to meet the ward, while their husbands stayed home and took care of the children. And they also said, and this is the most powerful argument in North Dakota, they said women were not asking for the vote. And many women actually opposed women's suffrage. And to back that up, the railroad pioneered polled 82 women and in 1913, and 71 of them said they opposed women's suffrage. So it was pretty easy to find opposition. The Anti-Suffrage League also said that women would vote as their husbands told them to, so there was no need to add their vote to that pile of votes. I don't know how many, I have found in the records, so a few women who said, I didn't vote as my husband told me to. And I think, there's quite a lot of love. A very interesting argument that the anti-suffragists used was that women's political positions and their interests were covered by their husbands' political interests. This concept, this is a legal concept called coverture. And it's interesting because it's one of the first laws to start falling when women go to the legislatures and ask for equal rights. Coverture goes very early. Coverture means that a woman can't sign a contract, she can't control her income. She's making a living. She has to give her money to her husband. That his vote is her vote. Whatever he says is her voice. It's a very, very old legal concept. Comes into the United States via the English body of laws that we adopted when we became a nation. But it's also dropping away very quickly. It's very interesting to see the anti-suffragists bringing this law up, this concept up in 1913. So the anti-suffragists won in 1914, but 2 years later, the political winds in North Dakota shift very far to the left, and we elect a nonpartisan league governor, Governor Lynch Frazier. The House elects a majority of nonpartisan league members. The Senate is not a majority of nonpartisan league. Now, the Nonpartisan League has its roots in the Socialist Party and the Farmers Alliance. Both of these organizations supported women's rights. So it's not too surprising that we find the Nonpartisan League stepping up and offering women a limited suffrage bill. It's a little disappointing considering the roots of the Nonpartisan League to see the limitations on this bill. But in the 1917 legislature, a limited suffrage bill does pass. It is signed by the governor. It does not have to go to the people. And women finally have extended suffrage rights in North Dakota. The 1917 law allowed women to vote for presidential electors, county officials, some city officials, but not including police magistrate, and township officers. They could not vote for members of the legislature or for U.S. Senator or Representative to Congress. So it's an extension, but it's still very limited ability to vote. Finally, in 1919, let's see, that's Governor Frazier signing the bill. Yeah, that's the second of the two pictures I know of concerning women's suffrage in North Dakota. If you're involved in a movement, take pictures. Historians will be very happy with you. So, in 1919, Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment. It goes to the states, and it's accompanied by this document from the Secretary of State inviting the states to either hold a convention or ask their legislatures to vote whether to accept or not to accept this amendment to the Constitution. It takes 3/4 of the states to make a constitutional amendment part of the Constitution. And it passed in August of 1920. North Dakota does accept and pass this amendment, but it's not till after the 3/4 have been reached, so we're kind of an anticlimax to that process. Full suffrage made a difference. Oh, you can't see it. I don't know why these are so pale. This is a ballot registration in Green Township of Barnes County in 1916. There are 7 women's names on the list. That's what I meant when I said women were not flocking to the polls. 1916, they had school suffrage only. So this ballot, the ballot they're going to get just says the name of the county superintendent of schools, the two people who are voting for, are running for that office. That's what they vote on, and then they go home. Another, in 1920, the same township, we see the registration of ballots, and on the first page there's about 90 lines, and not quite half of those lines are women's names. Some married, some not married. Full suffrage made a difference. Women were there. They went to the polls. It didn't matter. Green Township was a rural district. They went to the polls. They voted. They were glad to have suffrage. They were glad to have a reason to go to the polls besides voting for county superintendent. We talked a little bit earlier, Renee and I, about post-1920 women's involvement in politics. We have at least one important, we haven't filled all the slots yet. We just elected our first woman senator a couple of years ago. Mrs. Burdick was appointed to fill out her husband's term after his death a few years earlier. But in the early 1930s, Minnie Craig becomes Speaker of the House and is the first woman in the United States to hold the position of Speaker of the House. So we got that first. That's a really good one. We have a ways to go to fill in. The numbers that were in the paper, in the newspaper article today were very impressive. Very low numbers, very low percentages in among county superintendents and county commissioners and in the legislature. We have a ways to go. We had a good start in 1920. We just have to get revved up again and keep going. Thank you very much.